Where the cold cuts like a knife, there was a mining camp that seemed forgotten by God and man. It was one of those places where despair hung in the air along with the coal dust, where hope froze before dawn. And in that white hell, among more than 50 rough men hardened by brutal labor, there was only one woman. Her name was Lucia Marquez. She was 24 years old, and she shouldn't have been there. But life, that cruel teacher who never asks if we are ready for her lessons, had placed her on that stony path without giving her a choice. Lucia didn't work in the mine because she wanted to. She wasn't there out of ambition or for adventure. She was there because her two older brothers, Rodrigo and Esteban, had dragged her along with them when they lost everything in the valley: a gambling debt, foreclosed land, and the need to flee before the creditors came to collect in blood what they couldn't pay with money. The Marquez brothers had found work at Don Severiano Ochoa's silver mine, a man as ruthless as the snowstorms that lashed those mountains every winter. And since they had nowhere else to leave Lucia, they had brought her with them, promising her it would be temporary, that in a few months they would save enough to start over somewhere else. But the months had turned into a whole year, and there she still was. Lucia lived in a dilapidated cabin on the edge of the camp, a rotten wooden structure that let the wind through its cracks and piled up snow in the corners on the coldest nights. Her brothers slept in the barracks with the other miners, and she was left alone in that miserable shelter, with no company but the sound of the wind and her own thoughts. Every morning, long before the sun attempted to warm those inhospitable lands, Lucia rose to prepare breakfast for the workers. She cooked in a makeshift kitchen, with dented pots and a wood fire that never got hot enough. She made beans, hard tortillas, and coffee as bitter and thick as mud. The men ate in silence, glancing at her sideways, some with pity, others with something darker in their eyes. After breakfast, as the miners descended into the depths of the mountain, Lucia washed everyone's clothes in a stream that ran as cold as ice, so cold it left her hands purple and cracked. She scrubbed shirts caked with coal dust, ripped trousers and socks that smelled of misery and sweat. Her cuticles bled, but she couldn't stop because Don Severiano deducted money from her brother's pay for every garment that wasn't spotless. At midday, she prepared lunch. Beans again, tortillas again, perhaps a meager meat stew when there was any. And in the afternoon, when the sun began its cowardly retreat behind the snow-capped peaks, she cooked dinner. 3 meals a day for more than 50 starving men who never said thank you, who treated her like part of the camp's inventory, like the shovels and picks. Lucia had lost weight. Her once full cheeks were now sunken and her brown eyes had taken on a distant look, as if part of her soul had already fled that place. Her brothers barely spoke to her. Rodrigo, the eldest, 32 years old, had become sullen and bitter, drinking himself senseless every night to forget that he had dragged his sister into that hell. Esteban, 28, avoided her gaze altogether, ashamed but too cowardly to do anything about it. They both gave her barely a few coins a month, supposedly for her personal expenses, but Lucia knew they kept most of her salary to continue playing cards on Sundays, feeding the same addiction that had ruined them. And she said nothing because they were her family, because in that brutal world they were all she had, even if they were the chains that kept her bound to that suffering. But there was someone who did see her. Someone who noticed how her shoulders hunched a little more each week, how her hands trembled when she lifted the heavy pots, how her eyes filled with tears she never let fall. Elias Salazar was 38 years old and didn't work in the mine. He was what people called a mountain man, a man who lived off the land and with his own hands, who had built a small but prosperous ranch in a sheltered valley a few miles from the camp. He raised goats and sheep, grew what he could in that harsh soil, hunted deer and sold the pelts. Elias came down to the camp once a week to sell meat, goat's milk, and cheeses he made himself. He was a tall, powerfully built man with a thick beard that covered his jaw and large, calloused hands that had worked all his life. His eyes were steely gray like the sky before a snowstorm, but there was a warmth in them that contrasted with his rugged appearance. He always dressed in leather and thick wool clothing, wore a wide-brimmed hat that protected him from the sun and the snow alike, and carried a rifle on his shoulder because in those mountains, You never knew when you would come across a wolf, a bear, or something worse. Another desperate man. Elias had noticed Lucia from the first time he saw her, 6 months ago, when she arrived at the camp with her load of supplies. It had caught his attention to see her there, the only woman in that man-do-well place working like a pack mule. At first he thought perhaps she was the wife of one of the miners, but he soon learned the truth by discreetly asking around. The Marquez brothers had her working there without rest, and that made Elias's stomach churn in a way he couldn't explain. He was a solitary man by choice. He had lost his family to a fever years before, and had decided that solitude was safer than the pain of losing someone again. But something about Lucia awakened in him a protective instinct he thought was dead. Every week, when he arrived with his supplies, he searched for her face in the crowd. He worried to see her getting thinner, paler, more broken each time, and every week he promised himself that next time he would say something to her, offer her help, do more than simply watch her suffer. But the words never came because he didn't know how to approach her without scaring her or causing problems with those useless brothers who had her there. Everything changed one February afternoon when the snow fell so thick it seemed like a white curtain closing in on the world. Elias had arrived at the camp earlier than usual, pulling a sled loaded with 3 freshly slaughtered goats and several cheeses wrapped in cloth. The cold was so intense that his breath turned into dense clouds before his face. He had sold his wares quickly because the men were hungry and winter was merciless with provisions. He was about to leave when he heard a scream. It wasn't exactly a scream of fear, but of suppressed pain, from someone who was used to suffering in silence but had reached their limit. Elias followed the sound to the back of the makeshift kitchen, where he found Lucia kneeling in the snow, her hands submerged in a bucket of icy water filled with clothes. She was crying, but not from sadness, from sheer physical pain. Her hands were so red and swollen they looked like burns, and several of her fingernails were bleeding. She had dropped a shirt in the snow and was trying to pick it up with fingers that no longer fully responded. Elias felt something break inside his chest. He approached silently, removed his sheepskin coat, and placed it over Lucia's trembling shoulders. She jumped, startled, and when she looked up and saw him standing there, her eyes widened in surprise. He said nothing at first, simply lifting her hands from the icy water with a tenderness that belied their imposing size. He examined them in the grayish afternoon light and shook his head. Several fingers were covered in chilblains, the cuticles torn, and she was trembling in a way that deeply worried him. "This isn't right," Elias said, his voice hoarse, as deep as distant thunder. "No one should be working like this. You'll lose your fingers if you keep putting them in freezing water." Lucia tried to pull her hands away, ashamed that someone was seeing her misery so closely, but he held them firmly. "Who's forcing you to do this? Your brothers?" She nodded without looking him in the eye, and Elias felt a cold rage settle in his chest. He knew men like Rodrigo and Esteban all too well, weak men who sacrificed others to save their own skin. "You have to get out of here," Elias told her directly without mincing words or using pretty language. "This place is going to kill you. If it's not the cold, it'll be the work. And if it's not the work, it'll be one of those men who look at you like you're a piece of meat." Lucia finally met his gaze, and in that look, Elias saw something that completely disarmed him. He saw weariness, yes, but also a spark of hope that she herself seemed surprised to feel. "And where am I going to go?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I have no money, no family other than them. I don't know anyone else in these mountains." Elias was silent for a moment, considering the words he was about to say, knowing that once spoken there would be no turning back. "With me," he finally answered. "You will come with me to my ranch. I have plenty of space, honest work to do, and no one to treat you like a slave. I will pay you a fair wage for helping me with the goats, with the cheese, with whatever needs doing, and you will have your own room, your own privacy, your own life." Lucia looked at him as if he had spoken to her in another language. The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that it couldn't be real. No one did something like that without expecting anything in return. "Why?" she asked with justified distrust. "Why would you do that for me? You don't even know me." Elias ran a hand through his beard, searching for the right words. Because I've seen how you're treated here, and it makes my stomach churn. Because I had a sister once and I wish someone had helped her when she needed it, but no one did. Because living alone in these mountains teaches you that life is too short to look the other way when someone is suffering and you can do something about it. It wasn't a romantic or poetic declaration, but it carried the weight of pure truth, and Lucia felt it in her bones. For the first time in months, she felt that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of that frozen hell, but reality hit her like heavy snow. My brothers will never let me go, he said bitterly. They need me here. Without me, they'd have to pay someone else to do this work, or do it themselves, and neither option is good for them. Elias stood tall, and at that moment he seemed as imposing as the mountains that surrounded them. Let me talk to them, he said in a voice that brooked no argument, and before Lucia could stop him, he had already turned and was heading toward the barracks where the miners rested before dinner. Lucia followed him, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would burst from her chest. When Elias entered the barracks, the place fell silent. This man had a commanding presence not because he was violent, but because of that quiet confidence that men who have survived the mountain for decades possess. Rodrigo and Esteban Marquez, he called firmly. The two brothers stood up from their cots, surprised. Rodrigo was shorter than Elias but tried to compensate with an aggressive attitude. What do you want, mountain man? If you've come to collect something, we have nothing. Elias shook his head. I'm not here to collect. I'm here to take Lucia with me. I need help on my ranch, and I've offered her a job. Decent work, with fair pay, and a decent roof over her head. The silence that followed was so heavy, you could cut it with a knife. Esteban looked at his older brother, waiting for him to react. Rodrigo turned red with anger, his fists clenched, and he took a step toward Elias. Who the hell do you think you are, coming here to take our sister? She's fine where she is. She helps us because she's family, and that's what family does. Elias didn't back down an inch. Family doesn't let their sister destroy her hands washing your dirty clothes in freezing water. Family doesn't have her working like a pack mule while you spend your money on cards and cheap whiskey. If you really cared, you never would have brought her to this hellhole. The words landed like hammer blows, and several miners murmured in agreement. Rodrigo looked around and realized he didn't have the support of the others. Most of those men had seen how Lucia was being treated, and although they hadn't said anything, they didn't approve of what they saw either. She's of age, Elias continued with deadly calm. She can decide for herself, but I've come to tell you this respectfully like men. If you try to stop her from leaving, if you try to follow her or cause her any trouble, then I won't be so respectful anymore. Do you understand? The threat was crystal clear. Rodrigo wanted to retort, but Esteban placed a hand on his shoulder. The younger brother had seen something in Elias's eyes that warned him he wasn't the kind of man to be trifled with. Let her go, Esteban said quietly. You know she's right. We've treated her badly. It's time she had her own life. Rodrigo stared at him in disbelief and rage, but finally released the breath he'd been holding. Let her go then, he spat. After all, she's never been good for anything but getting in the way. Lucia, who had heard everything from the doorway, felt those words like a slap in the face, but she also felt something release inside her. The invisible chains that bound her to those men out of family obligation were finally broken. Hey, if this story is captivating you as much as it's captivating me to tell it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss how it ends. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to make a difficult decision to get out of a situation that was destroying you? I'd love to read your experiences because we all have stories to tell, and sometimes simply sharing them helps us heal. Like this video if you think Lucia is making the right decision. And now, let's get to the next part. That same night, Lucia packed her few belongings into a worn cloth satchel. She didn't have much to take, just 3 mended dresses, a shawl her mother had knitted years before when they still lived in the valley, a small broken mirror, and a Bible, the only thing of sentimental value she had left. Everything fit in that small satchel, and that struck her with a sharp sadness. 24 years of her life reduced to objects that weighed less than a sack of flour. Elias waited outside with his horse, a large, strong animal with a dark coat that puffed out wisps of steam in the frigid air. The snow had stopped falling, but the sky was still covered with gray clouds that promised more storms before dawn. When Lucia left the cabin for the last time, she didn't look back. There was nothing in that place she wanted to remember, no happy moment worth preserving. Elias offered her his hand and helped her onto the horse, settling her in the saddle facing him. He gave her his thick fur coat because the one she was wearing was so thin that it barely stopped the wind. The journey to the ranch took almost 2 hours because Elias didn't want to rush the horse in the fresh snow that made the path difficult. They climbed narrow trails through pines laden with white, crossed a frozen stream where the ice crunched under the animal's hooves, and traversed a gorge where the wind howled like a tormented soul. Lucia rode in silence, clinging to the saddle, feeling the warmth of Elias's body against her back and the rhythmic movement of the horse beneath her. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel something akin to hope, though it was so fragile she feared it would shatter with just one breath. When they finally arrived at the ranch, Lucia was speechless. The place was nestled in a valley protected by mountains on 3 sides, sheltering it from the harshest winds. There was a solid, well-built wooden main house with a gabled roof that prevented the snow from accumulating too much. Near the house was a large stable where Elias kept his goats and sheep, a chicken coop from which a soft clucking sounded, and a shed for storing tools and supplies. Everything was covered in snow, but it looked well kept, tidy, built by the hands of someone who loved his land and his work. Elias helped Lucia dismount and led her toward the house. When she opened the door, the warmth of a wood-burning stove greeted her like a hug. The interior was simple, but welcoming. There was a living room with a dark wood table, hand-carved chairs, shelves with worn books, and kitchen utensils hanging from hooks on the wall. In one corner, the stove burned, keeping the place warm, and on top of it sat a pot, from which wafted the aroma of stew that made Lucia's stomach rumble with hunger. Elias smiled slightly at the sound. "First I'll show you your room, then we'll eat," he said in that deep voice that was beginning to sound familiar. He led her down a short hallway to a small but decent bedroom. It had a bed with a real mattress, not a canvas cot like at the camp. There were thick, clean blankets, a small wooden dresser for storing clothes, a window with fabric curtains overlooking the snowy valley, and a woven rug on the floor so her feet wouldn't touch the cold wood when she got up. It was more than Lucia had had in a long time, and she felt tears sting her eyes. "It's yours," Elias said from the doorway. "You can arrange it however you like. The door has a lock on the inside. No one will enter without your permission. This is your space, and it must be respected." Lucia turned to face him, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. "I don't know how to thank you for this," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't even know why you're doing this." Elias shrugged, his expression one of discomfort with gratitude. "I already told you why. Now get settled. I'll feed the horse and check on the animals. When you're finished, come to the kitchen and we'll have a hot meal." With that, he left and closed the door behind him, leaving her alone with her thoughts and her tears of relief. Lucia sat on the bed and, for the first time in a year, felt she could truly breathe. The mattress was soft, the blankets smelled of lavender, and the silence of this valley was so different from the constant noise of the mining camp that it almost seemed unreal. She allowed herself to cry all that she had kept inside, all the pain and humiliation and exhaustion, until she had no more tears left and only felt a clean emptiness, like after a storm that washes away everything rotten. When she calmed down, she washed her face with water from a pitcher on the dresser, combed her hair with her fingers since she didn't have a brush, and went out to the kitchen. Elias was serving the stew into 2 deep bowls. It was a venison stew with potatoes, carrots, and herbs that smelled heavenly. There was also fresh bread, yellow butter, and hot tea with honey. They sat down at the table facing each other, and Lucia ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it were a miracle. Elias ate in silence, but every now and then he glanced at her to make sure she was all right. "Tomorrow I'll show you how things work around here," he said finally. "It's not easy work, but it's not inhumane either. The goats need to be milked twice a day, The hens lay eggs that need to be collected, and I make cheeses that I then sell in the village and at the camp. There's also cooking, cleaning, mending clothes, the normal things involved in maintaining a house. But everything is done with time, without rushing, and nobody is going to yell at you or demand the impossible." Lucia nodded, still processing that this was real, not a dream from which she would wake up back in that miserable cabin. "And how much are you going to pay me?" she asked timidly, because she had never spoken about money with anyone but her brothers. Elias took a small leather pouch from his pocket and placed it on the table. 15 pesos a month to start, plus food and lodging. When you learn to make cheese as well as I do, I'll raise it to 20. And if you decide to stay longer than 6 months, we can talk about giving you a share of the profits." Lucia opened the pouch and saw gleaming silver coins. It was more money than her brothers had given her all year. "This is too much," she whispered. Elias shook his head. "It's only fair. Honest work is paid honestly. That's how it works here." That night, Lucia lay in her new bed, wrapped in clean-smelling blankets, listening to the silence of the valley broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl. And for the first time in so long, he slept without nightmares, without fear, without the crushing weight of despair on his chest. The first few days were about adjusting. Elias patiently taught her the ranch routine. He showed her how to milk the goats, something she found awkward at first because her hands were still injured, but which she mastered with practice. He taught her how to collect eggs without scaring the hens, how to prepare fodder for the sheep, and how to recognize when an animal was sick or needed special attention. Elias was a calm teacher. He never raised his voice, never became impatient when she made mistakes. He simply showed her again, with those large, surprisingly gentle hands, how to do things correctly. And Lucia learned quickly because she was hungry for knowledge, hungry to feel truly useful and not just exploited. In the afternoons, Elias taught her the art of cheesemaking. It was a delicate process that required exact temperatures, precise timing, and a touch that could only be learned through practice. He taught her how to curdle the milk, how to cut it, how to press the cheese in wooden molds, how to salt it, and how to let it mature in the cool cellar he had dug under the house. Lucia discovered she had a talent for this, that her hands, despite being damaged, had the necessary sensitivity to know when the curd was at the exact point. Weeks passed and something began to change in Lucia. Her cheeks regained color, her hands slowly healed with the herbal ointment Elias prepared, and her gaze lost that distance of a defeated person. She began to smile from time to time, at first shyly, then more naturally. She began to sing while she worked, songs her mother had taught her, and that she thought were long forgotten. And she began to feel something for Elias that she didn't quite know how to name. It wasn't just gratitude, although that was there too. It was admiration for his way of life, for his brutal honesty, for how he treated animals with affection and the land with respect. It was attraction to this man who seemed carved from the very rock of the mountains, strong but not cruel, solitary but not bitter. And it was something deeper, something that grew in her chest like the first spring flowers beneath the snow, stubborn and beautiful and full of promise. Elias also felt something changing inside him, though he wasn't used to naming his emotions. He had lived alone for so many years that he had forgotten what it was like to share space with another person, to hear footsteps that weren't his own in the house, to see a light on in another room at dusk. At first it felt strange, almost uncomfortable to have Lucia there, but he soon discovered that her presence wasn't an intrusion, but a complement. She brought life to that ranch that had been functional but empty. She brought conversation during dinners, laughter when one of the goats got into mischief, a different perspective on things he took for granted. And Elias found himself making excuses to be near her, to teach her things she could probably learn on her own, to listen to her soft voice recounting stories of her childhood in the valley, before everything went to hell. He found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, admiring how the afternoon sun illuminated her brown hair when she went out to hang the laundry, how her now healing hands worked gracefully as she kneaded the bread, how her eyes shone when she managed to make a perfect cheese. One afternoon in March, as the snow began to melt and the first green shoots peeked through the white, Elias and Lucia were working together in the barn. They had spent the entire morning helping a ewe give birth to twins, a complicated process because one was in a crooked position. Elias had used his expert hands and managed to reposition the lamb, and when both babies were finally born healthy and their mother licked them with exhausted tenderness, Lucia had wept with emotion. It was the first time she had seen life being born instead of just working herself to exhaustion, and something about that simple miracle touched her deeply. Elias had looked at her with a small, almost shy smile and said, "Life always finds a way, doesn't it? Even here, in these harsh mountains, life insists on going on." And Lucia had felt that those words meant more than he said, that they spoke of the two of them too, of how life had placed them on this path together against all odds. That afternoon, as they cleaned the barn and arranged fresh straw for the ewe and her lambs, Lucia gathered the courage to ask a question that had been nagging at her for weeks. "Elias," she said softly, "why do you live alone up here? A man like you could have a family, a wife, children. What made you choose solitude?" Elias stopped what he was doing, leaning against the wooden pitchfork, and for a long moment said nothing. Lucia thought that perhaps she had crossed a line, that she had asked something too personal, but then he began to speak in a hoarse voice heavy with memories. "I had a family once," he said, looking toward the barn window as if he could see the past out there. "A wife named Elena, and a little daughter, Carmela. We lived in a town further down near the border. I worked as a cowboy on a big ranch, and we were happy, or at least I thought we were. But when Carmela was just 4 years old, a fever came to the town. Typhoid fever, the doctor said. It took half the children and many adults too." Elias paused, swallowing hard. "Elena fell ill first, and then Carmela. I stayed with them day and night without sleep, praying to every saint I knew. But Carmela died first in my arms, so small her little body weighed almost nothing. And 3 days later Elena passed away too, calling our daughter's name until her last breath." His voice broke slightly and Lucia felt her heart ache for him. "After burying them, I couldn't stay in that town. Everything reminded me of them. Every corner, every sound, every smell. So I sold what little I had, bought this piece of land that no one wanted because it was too high up and too isolated, and came here to hide from the world. That was 11 years ago, and since then I haven't wanted to get too close to anyone because it hurts too much when they're gone." Lucia approached him slowly, unsure of what to say because there were no words that could mend that kind of pain. She simply placed her hand on top of his, small and pale against Elias's large and weathered hand, and squeezed gently. "I'm so sorry," she said with absolute sincerity. "No one should have to go through something like this, but Elias, listen to me carefully. You saved me when I was dying inside in that camp. You gave me not only a job and a roof over my head, but dignity and hope. And I know you're afraid of losing again, but living locked in fear isn't really living either. Your Elena and your Carmela wouldn't want you to condemn yourself to eternal loneliness for them." Elias looked at her then, really looked at her, and in his gray eyes there was a storm of emotions. "And what do you want, Lucia?" he asked in a barely audible voice. "What do you want from this life?" Lucia felt her heart beating so hard that he could surely hear it. She knew that what she said at that moment would change everything between them, for better or for worse. She took a deep breath and allowed herself to be brave as when she decided to leave the camp. "I want to stay here," she said with crystal clarity. "Not just as your employee, Elias. I want to build a life here with you, if you'll let me. I want this ranch to be my real home, not just a temporary refuge, and I want to get to know you, not just as the man who rescued me, but as the man you are, with all your past, all your pain, and everything you keep inside." The silence that followed seemed endless. Elias gazed at her as if he were seeing a mirage, something too good to be true. and then very slowly he raised his free hand and touched Lucia's cheek with his knuckles, a touch so gentle it seemed he feared she might break. "I don't know if I'm good at this," he admitted with brutal honesty. "I don't know if I can be the man you deserve, Lucia. I'm broken in ways that may never fully mend." She smiled with a mixture of sadness and hope. "I'm broken too, Elias. We all are in some way. But maybe two broken people can help each other heal. Maybe we can build something new with the pieces we have left." And in that barn that smelled of fresh straw and new life, Elias bent his head and kissed Lucia with a tenderness that belied his rugged appearance. It was a slow, careful kiss, full of unspoken promises and shared fears. And when they separated, they both knew that something fundamental had changed between them, that they had crossed a threshold from which there was no turning back. The following months were the happiest Lucia could remember. Spring arrived in full bloom and the valley transformed into a green paradise dotted with wildflowers. Elias and Lucia worked side by side during the day, and at night they sat on the porch of their house watching the stars while drinking tea and talking about everything and nothing. He told her stories of his youth, of when he learned to tame horses and survive in the mountains. She told him about her childhood in the valley, about her mother who had died when she was 16, about how her brothers had changed after their father's death. They shared recipes, secrets, fears, and dreams, and slowly, day by day, they fell in love with the kind of love that doesn't shout or make a fuss, but is built on small gestures and shared glances. Elias began leaving wildflowers on the table where Lucia ate breakfast. Lucia began mending her clothes with more care than necessary, embroidering small details along the seams. He built her a vegetable garden near the house so she could grow vegetables and herbs. She learned to tan hides and make tallow candles so he could sell them in town. One June night, when the air was warm and the sky was so full of stars they seemed about to fall, Elias asked Lucia to marry him. It wasn't an elaborate or romantic proposal in the conventional sense. They were simply sitting on the porch, as they did every night. And he took her hand and said, "Lucia, I've lived alone for a long time, and I thought I'd stay that way until I died. But you came along and reminded me that it's worth taking a chance on feeling, that it's worth building something with another person even if it hurts when it ends. I don't have a fancy ring, and I can't promise you luxuries, but I can promise that I will take care of you, respect you, and love you every day I have left. Will you marry me?" Lucia didn't have to think for a second. "Yes," she replied, tears of happiness streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." And they kissed under that starry sky while the crickets sang and the wind whispered through the pines, sealing a promise they both knew they would keep. They were married in July in a small chapel in the nearest town, a 2-day walk from the ranch. It was a simple ceremony with only a handful of witnesses, townspeople who knew Elias from his years in business, and who respected him. Lucia wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself from fabric Elias had bought especially for the occasion. He had trimmed his beard and wore his best linen shirt, clean trousers, and freshly polished boots. When Father Ignacio, a 73-year-old man who had baptized half the town, asked them if they took each other as husband and wife, they both answered in firm, clear voices without doubt or hesitation. And when the priest told them they could kiss, Elias lifted Lucia from the ground in his arms and kissed her with such intensity that the few people present applauded and laughed with genuine joy. After the ceremony, there was a modest meal in the town cantina, with mole, tortillas, rice, and beans. The owner of the cantina, a robust woman named Gertrudis who had a weakness for love stories, treated them to a banquet and refused payment. "You two deserve something good," she had said with tears in her eyes. "It shows on your faces that you've suffered a lot. May God bless you with many years together." Elias and Lucia returned to the ranch as husband and wife, and that night, in the room they would now share, they surrendered to each other with a mixture of passion and tenderness that left them both trembling and satisfied. Elias was careful and patient, aware that Lucia was inexperienced in these matters, and she felt safe in his large, gentle hands, loved in a way she had never imagined possible. They slept embraced, listening to the night sounds of the valley, feeling that they had finally found a home not only in that place but in each other's arms. The following months were a time of adjustment and building. Lucia moved entirely into Elias's room, and her old room became a storage space for the cheeses they were producing in ever-increasing quantities. The business thrived because the quality of their products was exceptional, and word had spread throughout the region. They sold not only in the mining camp and the nearby town, but merchants from farther afield were beginning to place special orders. Elias gave Lucia complete control of the ranch's finances, trusting in her intelligence and her skill with numbers, something his brothers had never valued. In September, as the leaves began to change color and the air acquired that sharpness that heralded autumn, Lucia discovered she was pregnant. At first she wasn't sure, but when the morning sickness became constant and her periods stopped, she knew for certain that she was carrying a new life inside her. She told Elias the news one afternoon while they were making cheese together in the kitchen. She simply stopped working, wiped her hands on her apron, and said, "Elias, we're having a baby." He froze, his hands still submerged in the vat of curds, staring at her as if he hadn't understood the words. "What did you say?" he asked hoarsely. "That we're going to be parents," Lucia repeated with a nervous smile because she didn't know how he would react, considering what she had lost before. For a terrible moment, Elias said nothing, and Lucia feared she had made a mistake by telling him so directly. But then he came out from behind the table, swept her into his arms, ignoring her protests that his hands were dirty, and hugged her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Really?" he whispered against her hair. "Are we really going to have a child?" And when she nodded, she felt tears wetting her neck, tears from a man who had thought he'd never have a family again. Lucia's pregnancy was calm and uncomplicated. Elias became even more protective, insisting that she not lift heavy things, that she rest more, and that she eat the best portions. He called a midwife from the village, Doña Remedios, an experienced 61-year-old woman who had delivered more than 200 babies, and paid her to come and check on Lucia once a month and to be present when the time came for the birth. During the long months of waiting, Elias built a hand-carved wooden crib, working on it at night by candlelight. Every detail was made with love. Forest animals carved into the posts, a smooth yet firm base, and finishes polished to a shine. Lucia knitted wool blankets, sewed tiny clothes, and prepared soft cloth diapers. They converted Lucia's old room into a nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow and building shelves to store the baby's things. And at night, Elias would place his hand on Lucia's growing belly and talk to the baby, telling him stories of the mountains, promising him that he would take care of him and love him with every fiber of his being. In April, as the snow melted and spring painted the valley green once more, Lucia went into labor. It was a long and difficult delivery that lasted almost a full day. Doña Remedios stayed with her the entire time, guiding her through the contractions, telling her when to push and when to breathe. Elias waited outside the room, pacing like a caged animal, his fists clenching whenever he heard Lucia cry out in pain. He prayed as he hadn't prayed since the death of his first family, begging God to protect his wife and child, promising anything in exchange for their safe passage through this. And finally, as the sun set over the horizon, painting the sky orange and purple, the strong, healthy cry of a baby was heard. Doña Remedios opened the door with a huge smile. "It's a boy," she announced, "big and strong like his father, and Lucia is tired but fine. Come in and meet your son." Elias entered the room on trembling legs and found Lucia lying on the bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a bundle wrapped in blankets. When she pulled back the fabric so he could see the baby's wrinkled face, Elias felt his heart expand so much he thought it would burst in his chest. "He looks just like you," Lucia said, her voice weak but happy. "Look at him. He has your gray eyes." Elias extended a finger and the baby grasped it with his tiny hand. In that moment, Elias knew he would do anything to protect this family. "What shall we name him?" he asked, unable to take his eyes off his son. Lucia thought for a moment. "I want to name him Gabriel," she said finally. Like the messenger archangel, because he is the message that life goes on, that love is stronger than pain, that there is always hope even when all seems lost. Elias nodded, tears streaming freely down his weathered face. Gabriel Salazar, he said, testing the name. Welcome to the world, my son. And he kissed his wife's forehead with boundless gratitude, knowing that she had given him not only a son, but a renewed reason to live, to love, to keep going, despite all the pain of the past. The following years were filled with prosperity and happiness. The ranch grew, and with it its reputation. Elias and Lucia hired additional help when the work became too much for the two of them alone. 2 years after Gabriel was born, a daughter was born whom they named Elena, after Elias's first wife, because Lucia insisted that honoring the past didn't take anything away from the present. As for Lucia's brothers, no one ever heard much from them again. Rumors circulated that Rodrigo had died in a mine collapse, though it was never confirmed. Esteban appeared at the ranch once, 3 years after Lucia had left, asking to borrow money. Lucia received him cordially but firmly, gave him a hot meal and some money as a gift, not a loan, and made it clear that this would be her last act of kindness. You made your choice, Esteban, she told him, and I made mine. I don't hold a grudge against you, but I don't owe you anything either. Use this money wisely and build your own life instead of destroying others. Esteban left with his head down, and Lucia never saw him again, and so the years passed in that valley of snow-capped mountains, where a woman who had been treated like a slave by her own blood found true love in the arms of a lonely man who thought his heart was too broken to beat again. Together they built not only a thriving ranch but a family filled with love, laughter, and hope. And when their grandchildren asked them to tell the story of how they met, Elias and Lucia would look at each other with that understanding only couples who have weathered storms together possess, and they would tell the story of how love saved them both from the cold. And so this story ends, friends. If you've made it this far, I sincerely thank you for sharing this journey with me. Stories like Lucia and Elias's remind us that it's never too late to start over, that true love exists in the most unexpected forms, and that sometimes the family we choose is worth more than our blood relatives. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel to continue hearing stories that celebrate human resilience, true love, and hope that never dies. I'd love for you to share in the comments. Have you ever had to make a brave decision to change your life? Have you found love or hope when you least expected it? Your stories matter, and this community is here to listen and support you. And tell me, what did you learn from Lucia and Elias's story? What are you taking away from this tale? See you in the next video, and remember, there is always hope, there is always a way out, and it's always worth fighting for a life of dignity and love. See you soon.